The impact of that when approached from a very, what sometimes often is a very narrow lens. And one of the ways I feel like we can make it as clear as possible, because it's the lens in which I will talk about the history of this place. And what we talked about at the last session was the lens of economic development. Oftentimes that's a narrative the arts sector, but a lot of sectors actually, are oftentimes asked to fit themselves in, right? And what happens? Right? What does it look like over time when that dynamic persists? And that is the feedback loop through which the system then makes decisions. So we're hoping that today's discussion and the narrative of this place starts to unpack some of what we talked about at the theme session. I hope that made it a little bit clearer. Any other thoughts in terms of the last session, things that kind of stood out to you all? All right.
Could you share the kind of concept of the think session?
Thank you. No, not fully, if you want to.
Yeah, I'll just share very briefly. So we divided the engagements into trainings, which you had last time, which happened at Phoenix Center for the Arts, and then into something we call think sessions. These were inspired by the jazz sessions or the peñas or the quilombos. Informal but intentional spaces where we can exchange ideas around arts, politics, place that are meant to be a little more flexible. So this is really a space where we're going to do a lot more talking today. It's a dialogical format, and so we invite you into that with Raquel and Joe
Our
today.
take has been evolving on around health equity. So I was born and raised in Tempe, Arizona. I went to Tempe High School. I went to ASU for my undergraduate. One of my dearest friends is Melissa Werner, who I know you know. I've known her since high school. And then I went to, my first job out of college was at the ASU Alumni Association. We made the friends, and then we sent them over to the people who made the funds happen. And then I went away to Georgetown for my master's and lived away from Arizona for 10 years and came back about, I can't believe it's been 15 years now. And in that process also worked on a PhD, which I graduated from in 2008. And from Antioch University in leadership and change. I grew up in Tempe at that time. It felt like a very small community. And Congressman Mitchell was my high school teacher. He was my government teacher. His wife was my business teacher. And Neil Giuliano, who was the next mayor out of Tempe, was my first boss out of college. And so I am a really, rooted girl in Tempe. And in addition to that, my family has generations and generations of our family have lived in this whole Southwest area for eons, right? My father was a migrant farm worker, and my mother was from a small mining community that most people say Miami, but people from there say Miami. And she was a nurse, and my father was a community organizer who helped start the United Farm Workers here. So I grew up around movement building. I grew up around a lot of arts and culture, actually, because that was so much part of the movement. And I really experienced movement work through song and through art and through theater. And so I just always feel it's super important for y'all to know like who the people are who are speaking to you. And I'm really honored to be here today and to share this time with all of you. And I know some of you, and some of you are new faces to me. I was a consultant for 17 and a half years for foundations and nonprofits around the country before I started working at Vitalist Health Foundation. And about 4.5 years ago, I had an opportunity to join their staff. And Vitalist has been around for 21 years. We were created from the sale of St. Luke's Hospital. We used to be called St. Luke's Health Initiatives. Now we're Vitalist Health Foundation because folks in the community told us that the work we supported was vital and that our investment served as a catalyst. So We put those together and came up with Vitalist.
I didn't know that.
And our tagline is a catalyst for change, for community change. Our vision is that all Arizonans and individuals and communities in Arizona are healthy and resilient. And we know that healthy people who are resilient have to be healthy in many dynamics within their community. It is not about just healthcare. We actually know, depending upon which literature you're reading, that your physical, body and your cells and your background only really determine, depending upon who you're reading, between 10 and 20% of your health. We also know that your zip code plays a huge role in your health. We have in Fountain Hills, there is a 14-year lifespan difference between Fountain Hills and South Phoenix zip codes. So in less than a half hour, if you're taking the freeway at the right time of day, you will experience a 14-year life expectancy difference. So when we talk about that, we say, imagine that you have 2 infants in your arms, and one of them was born in this zip code and one was born in the other. And that one of those are going to have 14 more years of family and celebrations and vacation and birthdays. And that's significant. It is significant. And we ask ourselves, why is that the case? And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But we look at asking those questions through this lens. We know that folks enter the door from different elements of a healthy community. And you will not see arts and culture actually on this wheel, and we've been criticized for that. And when I spoke with Maria Rosario Jackson, I asked her, well, did you notice that? And she said, yes, but arts and culture manifest itself in all of these elements. And so we want to be sure to always reinforce that that does happen, and that it does live in all of these places. So we'll talk a little bit about this later, but the conversation that we're going to be entering into, I think, is a great example of how many of these elements of a healthy community have been ignored, or only certain people have been invited into those conversations that determine the health of an organization or the health of a community. And then just in closing, before we move over to Joseph, I will just say that I was in New Orleans a few weeks ago with at this thing called the Unity Summit, which was a gathering of approximately 700 funders. Mostly were funders. I would say about 400 of them, 500 of them were funders. The rest were people from the community and academia. And that 500 was all like people of color. So it was amazing to be in a room of philanthropy where there were mainly funders who were people of color, and we were talking about healthy communities and what is the role of foundations within that prospect. And we had 2 representatives from Arizona there, but the one that I'm going to mention today made this comment at a plenary session where it's Viri Diana Hernandez from Center for Neighborhood Leadership, and she was asked to speak on resiliency, and she got up in front of all these funders and said, I don't want to be resilient, I want to be well. Resiliency costs me. There is a cost for me to be resilient. And so when we look at these elements of a healthy community and we think about what are the inequities, the health inequities, which means those inequities only exist because we know there can be something done different so that there won't be disparities between the two, between any of that, between the people who are experiencing those. And it hit me in a way that I never thought about it before, that we don't center wellness. And so we're going to also talk a little bit about what happens when you do center wellness in the process of building community and community development. Thank you. Any questions real quick before we move on? Yes.
I don't want to derail. Is there a plan to add arts and culture to that? It's called out.
No, there actually isn't, and we'll have to talk to our communications director about that. Maybe Mary and Joseph get on that. But I actually like the idea, and I'm going to hand out something a little bit later to embed arts and culture within each of those. What would that look like?
Right.
And I do think it looks different in all of these, and some of it is not what people traditionally think of as arts and culture, and so. Yes, John Ford,
So
we
it
can
should
talk
be
to.
one of those rings instead of its own.
It certainly could be. I mean, it
That'll be
adds to
nice.
that.
And I only push on that a
Yeah,
little
no,
bit
it's good
because
too.
I know I a lot of times hear in arts and culture that sometimes it's paid lip service to, but not actually implemented. So
Right. And I think it also opens up a conversation to ask who determines what is arts and culture, and where does arts and culture live, and where does legitimate arts and culture live, right? So that is part of, I think, the larger conversation. Sometimes when we have missing information, it allows us to ask provocative questions, and that's a really good one.
Yeah.
So thanks.
Awesome. I have a question for the group. So there was a couple of ways we were talking about doing the case study through storytelling narrative of the space. One idea was that we give a quick opener, and then we can just meet down there to actually get us moving and we can get a kind of closer look, and then work our way up as we kind of go through some of this historic narrative. I'm open to other suggestions as well. I recognize the sun is out. And, so I'm going to open it up and see what people think and how we would like to move forward with this piece. A lot of this is all centered around reflective listening as well. It's about being immersed in part of the storytelling as the backdrop. And so however you want to experience that, I figured I'd open that up to the group first though.
What's the alternative?
Moving sounds great.
Moving into the sun does not.
I'll say this, it's not as hot as it may appear. You have a lot
Yeah,
of
it's like 10 minutes.
greenery
Just
as you walk through there, so there's some
Just 10
areas in
minutes.
which there's
The view is worth the,
there's a tree cover, but you also get a better view of the area as a whole if you walk around a little bit, so it's strictly up to you though.
I think also something that we want to encourage in the way that we're thinking through equity in place is that it helps us to understand how to ask questions when we feel the way a space feels. And I can tell you from being in this space, as you walk down there, it's very different from perceiving it up here and those of us. So I think it's worth it having walked that space. I think it brings something else to light.
I'm excited to do it without Sherman because of all the bunny rabbits and all of the birds that are in this habitat. My hunting dog goes crazy.
And we do have
I'm
extra
like this the whole
water
time.
and oranges and things to bring down with you as well.
So if we're up for it, we'll do a quick opener here, and then we can meet where the shade is, which is should take us less than 10 minutes to get down there. Does that work for everyone?
Sure.
And then we can start the rest of the dialogue from where the shade starts.
That's good.
Yes, thank you for adding that as part of our reflective, building on practices of reflective practice to incorporate as part of the walk, a silent walk, as again, things are moving within the head, right? But as you're also taking in the scenery. So I would also invite that as well, for it to be a silent walk when we do relocate down to where the shade starts. Yes, absolutely.
So, walking mindfulness practice is a really great one, and I would really encourage you when you're walking to pay attention to how your feet feel on this pathway from the different levels we're going to go through. And also, what does the sun feel like, and what does the wind feel like? So when Mary talks about feeling into place, I think this is in part what she's talking about. And when we do work out in the community, if we have a stronger muscle around how we feel in that place, how our body feels in that place, and how aware we are of all the nuances that happen in place, the stronger we
In
feel.
1999, when I graduated, my mom was diagnosed with cancer for the first time. And it was a form of breast cancer. And she tells the story all the time, and she's very open about it. And she lets me share it, so I'm sharing it. But at the time, it my mom in the 90s was a bigger than life organizer. We knew everybody. We were the kind of family that like we would go to the store and my mom would say hi to like 10 people, right? And it would take forever to get out of the checkout line because you're just always talking to folks. My mom is like a very, and still does, a very big presence. And she was the one who introduced me to what the concept of even an organizer was, because she considered herself an organizer back in the day. She was responding to things like gang violence, my older brother, we had a drive-by at our house, which prompted everything. And she had such a sense of love for South Phoenix and a sense of like stewardship, that really kind of, that was my first understanding of even the importance of this place to like our family. I had met this guy, I kind of remember his name, Steve Brittle. This man named Steve Brittle from the South Side. Larger than life as well. And he was speaking about the health impacts of South Phoenix and the cancer rates. And that was the first time I was like, there was a level of understanding that I had never learned about before. And it was all about this story of the Rio Salado and what was around here. And it was about 2 years after I had graduated high school. My mom had already been diagnosed and was well into like her own service around that issue that had come up. And it was the first time I'd ever heard it. I was like 19. And I started to dig in deep and started to remember my mom and dad talking about Golden Gate and the old neighborhood is what they would always call it, and the sadness that was in that story as well, and how that was connected to the airport. And I started to do my homework, and from about 2001 to about 2013 was like a consistent journey to try and put together my own understanding and narrative of this place and how we got here. And that's what it was rooted in. And one of the things that got me the most information about this actually came from a publication from ASU. And if you Google South Phoenix environmental racism, the first thing that comes up is this publication. And in that, I started to really put together what I understood was the dominant narrative of this place. And so that's what I want to share with you today in terms of a timeline that will start down there where the shade is. And as we move up, we'll just go over the timeline as I've started to pull it. So I think the only story I ever really got of Phoenix early on was in grade school. And the only thing I really remembered about the story was that there was this businessman who was part of a number of business kind of settlers that came across this area, saw Waterway, and saw that there was these intricate canal systems left over from the Hohokam, as we've come to understand, and that it was let's rebuild this city, right? Rebirth it like a phoenix, and thus was named Phoenix by one of the first kind of business settlers that was here. That's the basic understanding of the story of the founding of Phoenix as I've come to understand it, and I've come to learn it from our own education here in school. As I started to dig in deeper and understand, okay, well, what did that mentality start to build? What we saw and what I continue to see is this iteration of a very strong business-centered, business class narrative. And folks who really represent that type of a sector and priority consistently in the place of decision maker. And so when we start from this earliest understanding of who founded Phoenix, the first decision, one of the earliest decisions that then marker what this place was used for was for agriculture. And so farmland was all part of what was the initial economic structure that Phoenix was founded on. And pretty much all of the late part of the 1800s, it's all about building the agriculture piece, and the turning point for that agriculture like boom was when we got the railroad, which I think you all would have passed over coming southward, which is still there, right? And so between here and downtown, that railroad, which, let me see, 1887 was when that railroad was constructed. And from that moment, the idea was two things. That was the dominant narrative of what was used was we got things that we're trying to produce and then ship out to sell. And so between farmland and railroads and warehouses were your black and brown populations. And from the moment that the railroad was created, like in most cities, the segregation line was clear. South of the railroad was for the people of color. North of the railroad was for the white affluent folks, the founders of Phoenix. For those of you who don't know, on Central, like north of here, right, where downtown is, that used to be called Mansion Row, right? It was all of the major, what was it? Millionaires Row. And all it was mansions right up Central. And it was all the major business owners of the local industries at the time, like your Barry Goldwaters and your Phoenix 40s, right? For those of you who don't know, right? But south of the tracks was the working class. And between the 1860s and the early 1900s, as the narrative of Phoenix grew, as a place to like the new frontier, and a place where you can set up shop and thrive, if you were white, was the dominant narrative of Phoenix. And the dominant narrative that came out of this area was, this is where the waste goes. And so, where is it? By the 1920s, what we had was two things. By the 1920s, you had the railroad starting to be populated with meatpacking plants and stockyards, and the first iterations of industry. And at the same time, you had your first, waste management site was placed in 1917, right up on the north side of the river. And to give you an understanding of how the structure was set up was in 1917, you had your first waste management. For the rest of the city, we started to have running water, but there was no running water south of the river. So we had the waste piece, but we didn't actually have any of the infrastructure. By 1920, you had designations of areas that included people as being hazardous. And so in terms of what persisted as like redlining and lack of investment was all predicated from 1920 of people in this area because of the lack of infrastructure and the level of poverty that consistently came out of who the people were in this area. Everything was considered hazardous. And so even in terms of people, so black and brown folks were also designated as hazardous. And I had researched this up, and it was the now I'm looking at NAREB, the National Association of Real Estate Boards. So they had, in part of what designated like what was valuable property, what was not, had designated black and brown people as hazardous in the same way that an industrial waste site is hazardous. And it was all part of their index of how then cities and municipalities would determine where resource allocation went, including the city of Phoenix. And so when we started to hear the stories of the lack of investment and, you know, my mom and dad talking about how before the bridge ever happened, when flooding happened, people couldn't get north of the river, right? That was just part of the historic narrative of what my grandparents' parents kind of struggled through and went through. But when I started to understand what was the design around that, what was the purpose behind all of the lack of investment and how we got there, it really started to come from how people understood the utilization of the land and housing. And then you had organizations like the National Association of Real Estate boards, which were largely white, determining what was valuable property and what was not. And so, again, none of this was taught to me in school. Right? Like, most of this was kind of digging up what I could find. But the thing that was significant in terms of a turning point was the 1930s. And part of what happens in the 1930s is that you had this funny moment between World War I and World War II, where World War I taught the local business community that we could apply for these federal subsidies, and that looked like cotton. And so all of the fruit and vegetables and whatever kind of farmland that was once the priority of what we were growing, after the First World War, some folks like what is it? The guy who created Goodyear tires. And Paul Litchfield, who worked for Goodyear, right, where Litchfield is now named after. Those folks in 1912, after the First World War, started to say, oh my gosh, we could get these large federal grants for cotton, because cotton was used in tires and in airplane wings for military industry. So they got all of these huge subsidies and bought up a lot of farmland and converted them to cotton. And it was essentially capitalizing on wartime efforts. And when that small, the lucrative practice in that in 1916, folks started to buy up huge stockpiles of farmland and converting them to cotton. Got it. By the time the Second World War came, what you had was a large business community that had already had the practice. And as they were building up between the time the U.S. actually got into the war, what you had was the business community going to the state legislature and systematically making Phoenix in this area military contractors to relocate. And so what you had was, after the First World War, you had the United States government saying, we need to relocate all of our military industries from being all in one central location on the East Coast across the country. And so you had the federal government paying large military industries to move to areas like the Southwest. And in order to incentivize in the 1930s all the way to the 50s as much of that movement as possible, you had the business community going to the Arizona State Legislature and doing deregulation to make the land as open to use as possible. You had very fierce anti-union legislation that culminated in right to work in 1943, 1942. And you had a ton of money going to market and recruit relocation, which included expanding Sky Harbor Airport. And so all of that between 1930 and 1950 produced one of the largest industrial sectors in the country that housed, out of the 1,000 manufacturers at the time in 1950, 2/3 of them were housed within 2 kilometers of this spot here. Everything that was part of what you see here now was all part of industrial landfills that were the runoff of all of this new industry, was all right here. And this became one of the most contaminated areas in the country. And when we see the confluence of large-scale environmental justice crisis issues, where it's like, what do they call Superfund sites? We have one of the highest concentrations along the Rio Salado in the country. And that's all legacy from this 1930s to 1950s hyper-industrial growth of this sector. So that is from us to the 1950s. As we go ahead and make our way back up, I'll just close with the 1960s from like where my mom and dad grew up. And as we go, Raquel, actually, do you want to introduce what we're doing with that?
Well, as we walk along and you're headed back up, if you could just look to the side and pick up any stone that stands out to you and just bring it back up with you.
As you start to exit the Rio Salado, and you start to look at what's around the periphery, what you're gonna start to see are either the remnants of old industrial waste sites that are now converted into what is usually, what is it? It is, what is this called? Asphalt. Right, so it's asphalt creation, and a lot of the industrial zoning is still inhabited by, they're called chemical dipping plants. And so when you think of like the big structures that are on airplanes, right, like they have to get chemically dipped in order to withstand, you know, everything that it has to withstand up in the air. And a lot of that industry is still, like if you go down to 51st Avenue along the Rio Salado, you'll see these large, kind of like unnamed buildings, right? You don't exactly know what's there, but they're just these huge, massive properties. Most likely they are that type of industry, is industry that supports the airport. But a lot of that still exists here. The other thing that you'll see is the continued, what are they called? The dump sites. Like when you throw away your trash. And so as we come across on the other side of the freeway right here is, it's a waste site that's actually still in operation. And so that used to be all along here and actually even here. And it's part of what later would become part of this restoration project. But if you just go over like
The bridge, literally.
right, there's another waste site like still right there that's in operation. Yep. The
this was one of the, where the landfills were just overspilled into the space. So it's a very recent restoration.
And when all of that concentration of industry was here, at the same time, there was the most deregulation that we've ever seen. And so, you know, the practices of just dumping whatever waste is here persisted clear until 1999, 2001. And so the other thing in terms of where I left off, where military contractors were being recruited to this area, part of what they were recruiting them to was really cheap land with really low regulation and really cheap workforce. And you consistently see from like the 1920s, there's a quote from the Chamber of Commerce that talks about how Mexicans in particular are culturally suited to stoop labor in the fields, and culturally accustomed to low wages and poverty. In 1940, the Chamber of Commerce has a quote saying, Phoenix, oh, what was the number? It's like 44,000 people at the time or whatever it was. And they're the best kind of people. The next sentence, very small percentage of blacks, Mexicans, and foreigners. It's 1940. And so the narrative clear into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s about, hey, if you're a large military contractor, why do you want to relocate here? Is because there's a ton of cheap labor. And that cheap labor was always meant to be black and brown workers, black and brown workforce. And so as the 1950s and 1960s went on, Phoenix went through the exact same dynamic as a metropolitan city goes through of white flight. Right? And white flight was when the largely white upper class affluent sector in the north side started to relocate out to the suburbs. And when you think of the folks like Barry Goldwater and like the business elite in the 1930s working hard to deregulate everything to culminate into the best way to incentivize new business military contractors to the area, they were also selling them on, and we have cheap housing out in the beautiful suburbs. And you can relocate your workforce here as well. And housing and the construction industry of housing became a fundamental part of our own economy that persists even now. And the building of suburbs was predicated on all of this recruitment of large military contractors relocating the workforce. Now come back to this major industrial sector that was created to uphold the economic development of Phoenix. All of the production and manufacturing to create suburbs out in the boonies, right? To create the Maricopas, to create the Glendales, to create the Avondales. All of that manufacturing still happens here. So the place that allows the build out of the suburbs in the Phoenix metropolitan area is still this large industrial zone. And in the 1960s, when we had the boom of building out to the suburbs, a lot of that manufacturing and the output of that manufacturing in terms of the waste product had an epicenter here. And so the successful build out of places like Avondale, again, is predicated on the health outcomes of the people adjacent in this area. And so you just start to see and when we get to, so if this is the 1960s of like white flight into the suburbs and the massive build out of housing as a major economic driver of Phoenix, you still had that based off of this land area. In 1970, because it was such a boom, this process, the airport decided to expand again. In 1970 is when the first encroachment into the traditional Latino barrio of Golden Gate started. And in 1979, Golden Gate was gone. And this is where my parents' understanding of this area and how they were relocated to South Phoenix happened. Right, is during this time between 1970 and 1979. By the late 1980s, I think it was 1987, between the expansion of the airport and the creation of the 10 freeway and the 17, which all happened around that time, a lot more expansion happened in terms of our housing, a lot more need for industrial zoning. By 1987, 40% of what was zoned for housing in this area was rezoned for industrial zoning by 1987. And so that demonstrates again this continued narrative of economic development being understood from a very, very, very small frame of understanding of how the dynamics of the city are supposed to and meant to operate. When you think of who's centered to benefit from these types of decision making in the name of economic development, we start to see what comes out, right? And it's not like the system wasn't trying to receive feedback into, well, how should we do this? What is the best economic decision making for expanding our city? And how do we best go about doing that? They asked those questions. It was, who did they ask? Because they got full, thumbs up to do every single one of those decisions that we talked about. Every single one of those decisions had its own form and version of civic engagement. Whether or not it was equitable, I think is clear in the outcomes. And so this question of, if we're saying, what if it's true that the arts and culture sector is in a unique privileged position to help influence and define how civic engagement happens, at least around economic development decision making. How could we understand historically how those decisions have been made and the outcomes of which that type of process produces? And what do we want to do differently? The last thing I want to say is, in this article, if you look up environmental racism in South Phoenix, the first thing that pops up is this ASU article. There's a line in there that talks about white privilege. And it was the first time I really got to understand it. And I actually just read it for this. I've read this thing a million times. It's the first time I read this line in it, and it defined white privilege as the set of ideologies and practices that are meant to reproduce white advantage over space and time. That was okay, now I get what white privilege is. And when I started to add it to the narrative of who did all of this decision-making privilege, and how did that, if it's true, right? If white supremacy is inherent in our system, right? Which is part of what we're wrestling with, because we have to examine whiteness if we're going to examine racial disparity everywhere else. If that's true, in this historic discourse that has been researched and talked about and has, you know, a documented narrative of how these decision-making were marketed, if that narrative is true, what type of white advantage did that continue to perpetuate and create? And how do we start to understand what we see today? When we look at South Phoenix, and to this day, it has a 14-year life less expectancy than other parts of the same city. To this day, we have 3 times the rate of cancer than the other parts of the city, right? To this day, we have 3 times the rate of heart disease than any other parts of the city. To this day, we have 3 times the rate of diabetes than other parts of the city. And we can go on, right? We can go every little marker of these elements and talk about the disparities that continue to manifest themselves here. But we don't talk about the historic narrative that produces those disparities. And we don't talk about them in reference to the more affluent parts of our city and our county at this point that benefit from that narrative, the advantage from that narrative. And so that is part of what I started to learn and grow to understand of this space.
When was the time that you started to learn that history? Okay, so there is something incredibly important around understanding the role of history and its multiple narratives. And so if we're looking at this through an equity lens, can somebody tell me how this group has been talking about what equity means? So equity, the idea of equity is that there is a process or mechanisms that are in place that you do to get to equity. So that equity basically is this concept that we have the opportunity for everybody, regardless of who they are, to live healthy and well lives. And when we get towards that, we're moving towards equity. And those processes look different, right, for different people and for different actions in the community. In the foundation world, what equity looks like is this notion that if we are going to have a vision that says we want all people and communities in Arizona to be healthy and resilient and well, right? That we have to figure out which is the population that we want to focus on in that big Arizona piece. And one of those areas and one of those populations for the last probably 15 years of this foundation has been South Phoenix, Central Phoenix and South Phoenix, and Maryvale in particular. Worked hard at building relationships within those communities. Those communities were chosen because there was an acknowledgement, it was an unconscious acknowledgement, I will say, that wasn't necessarily built off of data, but was built off of visual values. So I have a value that I want people who are marginalized to be able to have access to things that can make them healthy. And so while there was no data work done on that, there were people who worked at the foundation at that time who just knew that from being in the community, from living in the community. And I'm making that distinction on purpose, and I'll get to it in a minute. So, so out of the values that they had, their experience and relationships with the community, they selected these areas and began investing in them. And they invested in them in lots of different ways. Initially, it was kind of typical, like if your proposal has a van or a computer written into it, you're going to probably get it. And then it changed, and it changed to be that they realized those things don't make a real big difference in the health of individuals and communities. They are important, but they don't necessarily make the difference. So they shifted their model to look at asset-based community development. And what was inherently important about that shift was that ABCD, asset-based community development, roots itself in a couple of beliefs. And one of those beliefs is that people in the communities have the answers to the challenges that are in front of them. They may not have access to the resources to help them manifest that, but they have the answers. That we believed as a foundation, and we do believe as a foundation, that it's important to support leadership from the ground up. So not leaders, leadership. And we also believe that we know that social transformation requires collaboration, but it also requires community organizing. And that's one of our principles is, so don't be afraid to fund community organizing. And also fading into leadership. And there are 10 of them, but those are some of the ones that are the most prominent, particularly in the work that we've done in the work that we try and do in South Phoenix, that we contribute to. And I say all of that because the work was good, like really good. The people and organizations they invested in began to have a better awareness around their diabetes and around how walking was important and how place was important. So if you didn't have a sidewalk to walk on that didn't have cracks in it, then how great would that be, right? So you could be able to do that in a healthy and in a safe way. I will say that the struggle with that has been that the intentionality is there, but the commitment to what that really takes to do with rigor and discipline has not been always present. I think we're building that, we're working towards that, but it hasn't always been present. And so what that has allowed to have happen is that we do good work. We don't necessarily do transformative work. And so if arts and culture is about transformation, and about having an experience, one that you may be watching or through any of your senses may be experiencing, and you bring in this equity lens around how do you engage community within arts and culture, and you do that without knowing the history, you probably will have some really nice things, and they'll be good. They'll be really good. And I do mean that genuinely. I am not being sarcastic, not one iota. They will be good. So the question is how transformative do you want to be? And doing transformational work requires that you have an understanding in a very broad way of the history of a location, that you understand the data that emerges from the community, and not just data that's produced by institutions, but data that emerges from your relationship with folks in the community. If you do investments with that kind of a lens, and I'm going to talk about this as investments because I think arts and culture is an investment. You know, you invest your time, you invest your money, you invest your intellectual knowledge and your creativity. If you consider your investment from that lens, then it has some requirements, some conditions that are necessary to do that. And so I'm just curious, if that's the hypothesis, that to do transformative arts and culture work in the community requires that we have an understanding of the history, of the data, of the culture that exists there through multiple lenses. I'm going to include multiple lenses because, you know, institutions are often part of the community as well, or invite themselves in. If we have that, then we will be able to do transformative work. And transformative work in this context is about creating opportunities for those who are the most impacted, the most marginalized, to be able to gain benefit from those practices, to be able to have better health with other folks around our larger community. So if that's the hypothesis, then I'm curious what you guys think are the conditions that are necessary as an institution to make that happen. And I'm going to start with institutions and not with individuals, but we're going to go to individuals. So I guess if you want to talk about either of those, that would be fine. We'll just enter from whatever door we walk in. And so kind of underneath all those types of insights is this notion, this nagging question, and I know that they have asked you this probably in every single time, and I'm going to say it too. Who determines who is necessary? Who determines what is valuable or has value? So another condition then for transformative work is about sharing power. And can you break that down a little bit, unpack that for us? I know I'm crazy about this. Everyone is like, you talk about this all the time. But it is so valuable. And this is something called boundary of authority, role, and task. So what is the role that your organization or even you as an individual with knowledge play in an opportunity that is holding arts and culture as a way of building community? What is the role that you play? And there is a formal role and there is often an informal role that you play. Now let's just add in the power piece to it. What does the role of power play? What does the role of not having power play? Who determines that? Like, we're not looking for answers with that. These are about how you have a reflective practice to move through communities. So if you understand your role, and if part of your role is about creating opportunities for equity, then that would determine some of the tasks that you actually engender while you're doing your work. In the process, your tasks would look like opportunities for you to move closer to equity. Might mean asking the academics to close and listen and allow the residents to share their own data and their own interpretation. I mean, come on. Let me just tell you, when I did my PhD, I had to unlearn so much around how I was writing and what I thought was appropriate and correct. And I fortunately had this amazing chair who was she was a music therapist actually, and she was indigenous. And so she helped me unlearn and recognize that I actually come from multiple generations of storytellers, of people who are actually called hermeneutic phenomenologists. I had no idea I was a hermeneutic phenomenologist person. And so I learned this whole new language around what it means to observe phenomena and then to make meaning of it. So if I were doing that within the community, which I often do, that might look like sitting down in a cafe with an amazing resident leader named Maya Blanco, and her talking to me about economic opportunity in her community and saying, you know, like, there's this guy who owns this restaurant, and he's actually going to go work on the pipelines, like the oil pipelines, because in the summer everything gets really slow and their family needs the money to be able to make it through the rest of the year, so he's going to go make money. And then she said, and you know, like, that's kind of a form of economic displacement. And I was like, oh, girl, that analysis, I was like, this is so wonderful. And even my reaction to that says a lot about me. It says a lot about maybe what I was expecting. And I'm kind of a little ashamed of that. Maybe part of it was also like, yes, somebody who has an analysis, right? And who can articulate it. And so that was a very interesting moment for me with my background. So when we talk about this notion of what are the conditions necessary, the condition I needed was to be honest with myself about how I was holding the value and wisdom of that person in front of me. And if I were lying to myself or pretending through that, I know that this person would have seen right through it. And there would be not the relationship that there is today, which is about a lot of vulnerability. It's based on sharing family stories that we could have never got to if I hadn't been real with myself and her in that moment. And so I'm asking you all to contemplate and to think about what are those places in your work that you create those moments for.